I'm going to use just a little bit of time to give a bit of a description about how CSW functions, so that those who haven't had much exposure might get a bit of a sense to place the comments in context. CSW is 2 weeks in New York at the UN. It has, I'd say, broadly 4 main components. The first is the side events. Side events are events that are organised by governments or by UN bodies, which are high-level discussions around a particular issue. They often involve NGOs, and they're generally a pretty good cross-section of all the hot-button topics that are about at the moment and that are relevant to the theme. Then there's a whole program of parallel events, which are much the same but organised by NGOs rather than by states and UN bodies. And then there are the discussions around the agreed conclusions, which is the primary document that comes out of CSW each year. And those discussions occur between nations, with a whole lot of negotiations occurring around the edges of that, which is where the NGOs get involved. And then there are a series of resolutions, and different resolutions are proposed by different nations and are debated and are voted on at CSW as well. So all those things are happening simultaneously. And so when you get reports back at an event like this, you'll hear a whole mix of things. So you've heard Julie talk about the negotiation work and the attending parallel events and attending side events going on all at the same time. With the Equality Rights Alliance's involvement, we had just one delegate, myself, going this year. It's our first year, and in order to make that sort of worthwhile and to provide a bit of a mentoring experience for me, I was embedded in the YWCA Australia delegation that you heard Emma Bird discuss earlier. It was a fantastic delegation that contained some people who had some real experience in the area, and also a group of very dynamic and exciting young women who were really driving the enthusiasm of the delegation, which was fantastic. So the process for ERA before we went was for ERA to be involved in the Alliance's pre-departure work, which involved making submissions to government when the government called for NGO information about what should be in the government's position. We made a submission there, and that's something that NGOs in Australia can do regardless of whether you're going to CSW. If you've got a position on what the Australian government should be saying at the international level, that's a good point to start pointing that out. And then we assisted some young women to make nominations for the government delegation. And then we ended up with some fantastic NGO people on the government delegation, which we were very excited about. And then we started, simultaneously, I was working with YWCA Australia delegation on a series of fact sheets, on some postcards which were used in our discussions with people. And so we had a whole lot of stuff going on pre-departure. Then at CSW itself, I gave 3 parallel event presentations. Julie's spoken about 2 of those. The other one was an ERA-sponsored event, which was about the need for gendered data, particularly in target setting and target monitoring. And that was a fantastic presentation which featured Caroline Lambert and Elizabeth Broderick. And also we had a speaker from the Population and Development Fund, who was absolutely fantastic because she simply sat down and said, we need to bring data down to the 3 basics. If we're not ensuring those, then the whole thing is lost. And she talked about birth certificates, she talked about marriage registration, and she talked about surveillance of cause of death. And she talked about how those 3 pieces of information are the fundamentals of all data needed to record the experience of women. And so it was a really powerful presentation that was a real surprise to me, because I've been expecting us to be talking at high level about how you craft definitions and make sure that the information you collect is gender specific. So that was wonderful. At the same time, the YWCA Australia delegation was part of the broader worldwide delegation. So we had a training day on the Friday before CSW, which included training in how to do the elevator pitch. So if you've got 3 minutes because you know the person's that far from the bathroom and that's where they're headed, you could walk alongside them and make your pitch. So that was a really useful experience.
Really effective, I think.
Yeah. There was a lot of lurking outside the ladies. It was not an entirely savoury but extremely effective strategy. We then started putting that into practice in the first week. So we strategically determined who would be going to which side events and which members of which government delegations we wanted to target. And the thinking behind that was that we wanted to make contacts in the first week, particularly the early and mid part of the first week, so that we could start to build a list of people who would be interested in receiving language from us. And so we'd explain, using our advocacy postcards, what our major concerns were. We'd talk about how it was that we thought that should play out in the language. And then we'd offer to provide that language by email if they needed it. And so once we had a list of yeses, we compiled an email list and we started to use that. On the Thursday, I think it was, of the first week, we got the Chair's draft of the agreed conclusions, which is where the initial country statements are all in. Everybody's had a chance to look at the zero draft and the subsequent drafts of the agreed conclusions, and the Chair cobbles together a version which is more or less representative of what's happened so far. And at that point, we started doing the very late nights, where we'd sit up at night and work out what we thought the language should be. Particularly on the clauses that we had identified as being important. So I was allocated to work on data because that's become attached to my name somehow. And so we were looking at what the previously agreed language was, the sort of language that was more likely to get widespread acceptance because it had a history within the international context. And we put together fact sheets that we could use to send out to our email list. And we waved those in corridors and we stopped people at side events. And our aim was to get as much of our preferred agreed language or our preferred language into the agreed conclusions as we could. We were helped enormously in that by the Australian government delegation who, one of the interesting pieces of feedback we got from the worldwide delegation, which includes people from Japan, Canada, America, Palestine. There was a really broad group of people, Samoa. The feedback we kept getting was, your government is so good, they listen. And that the relationship between the government delegation and the NGO sector was so strong. So, for example, the Australian government held briefings. The delegation held briefings each day at 6. And we'd all send representatives to that briefing and we'd all talk about what we'd seen, what we'd heard, what was important, what was coming up. And that was an opportunity for us to share language with that delegation. It was an opportunity for us to identify who else might be interested in particular language. So it was a really good process. It also, that briefing process and the function held by the Australian government and the number of side events that brought us all together was an opportunity for the NGO sector to make contact with each other. In previous years, we've had a pre-departure briefing, and we didn't get that this year, partly due to timing issues, I think, because the election was a bad time for this. But I think we missed it, and I think it would be really good if we got that back in future years because it is an opportunity for the NGOs to get together beforehand and work out who's a potential ally, who's somebody that we can work with, where's the issue where we all cross over. That sort of thing would be really useful. But as it transpired, the government briefings and the various functions also functioned as a place for that. Women and young women's leadership was another area that we were focusing on, and getting some strong language in on FGM and early and enforced marriage. And we had some really good language come out of the Australian delegation during the course of CSW, which was really good to see. It was really good in particular to hear some comments made about sexual orientation and gender identity, because that again is another very disputed space. We had some good work done on disability, and particularly on the need to ensure that you don't just stick the word disability in, that what you do is you look at goals and you look at outcomes that actually reflect the experience of women with disabilities. So it was a really intense experience. We did spend a lot of time sitting in the corridor outside the negotiation room at 2 a.m. in the morning in the hope that targets would come out. They're people, not targets. Not targets, they're people. Would come out and we could talk to them about language. And that was a really interesting process for me because I hadn't approached language negotiation in quite such a dynamic and, above all, physical way, as you stride down the corridor next to someone handing over your postcards. So yeah, it was a really interesting process. I highly recommend it for anybody who's interested in the international context. But what struck me most about it was its serious applicability to the Australian context, despite the fact that we were talking about Millennium Development Goals, which don't easily translate into the Australian context because they are set in a development context. The potential for future application to Australia was a really interesting one, and it was very heartening to hear across almost all the parallel and side events that I attended a real acceptance that the realisation of human rights, and in particular the realisation of women's rights, was absolutely central to development and to a sustainable development. The development was not sustainable unless you're taking that initial step. So that was the main thing I took away from it.